For the most part, every week I have to find a reason not to call Chris Horner and say, I need you on the show right now. But I finally had all I could stand for this most recent period of time. I think it's been almost 2 weeks now. And when the UN last week reported that the planet is facing climate apartheid, I distinctly remember Chris Horner and us talking about the boy who cried wolf analogy in this. And I don't know if they finally reached that point, but he is back on the Newsmakers line with us. Chris, thanks for taking some time out this morning. Climate apartheid, huh?
Yeah, that's next in the denier. What other terms can they invoke? Hit parade.
Oh, my gosh. Have they used apocalypse yet?
Of course they have.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. Yeah, this was something. They've got a few problems. I was just, as you said that, I was pulling up a talk. I won't spend your time doing that now, but I have a nice slide that goes through the best of The Guardian, which is where we see, I see this reported, the best of The Guardian's headlines about the number of days we have left. I mean, as you know, they've gotten down to Gordon Brown's. I think he gave 50 days. Somebody else, Prince Charles, gave 100 months.
Yep.
They're back and forth. It's just whatever suits them at the moment, whatever comes out. So it's not like The Guardian or the other outlets that are rushing this silliness into the headlines are going to push back on it.
Well,
so they've got this credibility issue, right?
Yeah. Always have.
And well, there's this wolf. You called it wolf crying accurately. It's about this time every year, usually with the first heat wave in the northern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the late fall, early winter, when the Paris Treaty talks gin up, they start this number of days left business. So the trains are running on time.
Yeah, this is
the alarmist world.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I found that the next day, the hottest day in the history of mankind was reported, and I feel that was coordinated. But when I read about this UN report about climate apartheid and how the rich are going to be able to survive and the poor aren't, so now all of a sudden, instead of the devastation of the planet, only the wealthy are going to survive the climate apocalypse. And I thought about that for a second. I said, is this some sort of dark brilliance where they've finally gotten to the point where they've got the president of the United States, joining in on saying, I'm skeptical. I don't believe all this stuff is man-made, nor that, it's going to be something that we can spend all this money on and do anything about. And now they're using the fact that he's a rich guy to say, see, all the rich guys don't care because they're going to be able to build their whatever arcs and float off in some John Cusack movie.
Yeah, well, that raises an awfully good point. Rich guys say the darndest things. You remember when one guy, and they're in the political class particularly, you remember one guy who said, because the people pushing these policies, and I'm going to walk through how just completely obtuse this is, people pushing these policies, the governing class, are able to say things like, well, my proposal will cause your electricity rates to necessarily skyrocket and get nothing but chin-stroking admiration from people because no one they know, right, is going to be harmed by what they're talking about, which is energy rationing.
That's true.
They will never feel this. It's like people on low and fixed incomes don't exist. You can actually say these things as a law school lecturer / candidate for president and then to wow the editorial board of the San Francisco Chronicle. And this was not front page news. Oh, my gosh, we have a crisis in the governing class.
Yeah.
No, it was hailed as wisdom. So think it through. And by the way, this came, you probably saw this was trotted out on the 30th anniversary of saying we've got 10 years left on climate. So
I love these 30th anniversaries. It reminds me, I don't know if you ever watched any of them. I remember back in the day when you only had 3 networks to watch on television. Every year, Alan King would hold his final warning show. And it was Alan King's final warning. And then the next year, it was Alan King's next annual final warning. And I think he finally finished up at Alan King's 3rd annual final warning. But it's what I always think about with this. This is like, no, this time for real. But you mentioned mentioned why.
Well, wait, you have to think about this. We need to start a contest because I really can't wait to see what they say on the 50th anniversary of the 10th of 10 years left, right, on climate. Because gosh, they have to top themselves every year. We'll be beyond Holocaust denier analogies and
yes,
apartheid to what brilliance will we move on to?
Well, yeah, but this is, I don't know if the community, the at-large population is buying this, but I feel like it plays into the same sort of mindset that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, you're poor because people made you poor, and if you don't elect me to help me and my friends stay wealthy, you're going to continue to be destitute. But they're playing into a crowd that has been told this since the mid-'60s, and some of them are starting to lash out, and that's where we see some of the actual socialists coming saying, you know what, we're just going to straight up do reparations. We're going to take people's property. We're going to give it to our friends, I mean the people, and then the economy will crash like it did in South Rhodesia.
So this is not our point here, but this is, as we say, just in the context of, you saw what's going on in Portland and the latest Antifa violence. This is truly irresponsible of the media to continue enabling this sort of inciting rhetoric. I wrote about this in Red Hot Lies. We had Barbara Boxer on the floor of the Senate claiming that people who oppose her demands in the name of climate that wouldn't have any impact on climate, okay, but would leave you less able to deal with climate, but more on that in a moment, are like people who leave children in a locked car in a parking lot on a summer day with the windows rolled up. These folks incite regularly, and it is acceptable. It is not pushed back on. There is not even an eyebrow being raised. It's encouraged. It's abetted. It's fanned, and this is truly reckless. But so are, speaking of I'm poor because people made me poor, these policies are reckless. Remember, we know this is based on projections, but consensus and so on, and observations where these schemes are being tried. We know that climate policy, we have much more to fear from climate policy than from climate change.
Sure.
Climate policies cost, at least their scheme costs more than climate. They don't tell you that you're talking about if you, quote, do nothing, which is itself inherently, the premise is a lie, so do nothing, whether it's adaptation or constantly getting more efficient, lower units of energy per economic output and so on. That's just, the premise is silly, but you're talking about a fraction of a percentage less fabulously wealthy than we are projected to be. Let's make ourselves poorer now so that a generation or four down the road will not be a fraction of a percent less fabulously wealthy and much better able to deal with something that every single society has had to deal with, and the wealthiest societies have dealt with best, and that's called climate change. Because guess what? Flash news headline, climate changes, that's what it does. That makes me a climate change denier, of course.
Of course.
But climate changes, that's what it does, always has, always will. Do you want a richer world to deal with it? Call it Florida or Florida Plus, or do you want a poorer world? We'll call it Bangladesh. When the same storm comes, where do you want to be? I know where all the Antifa thugs want to be, and I know why.
Yes,
right? But they're demanding these policies that would encourage energy poverty, which is encouraging poverty, which, by the way, is leading to real people dying in the tens of thousands, as you and I have discussed, in Western Europe, in civilized, rich Western Europe, where they're imposing these policies, with an orgy of imposing these policies. They just voted to go net zero in the UK by 2050. There'll be a bird's nest in 2050. The airport will not be an airport; it'll be a bird's nest.
Well, and but the poverty is going to hit the people that they're using to create almost this Robespierrean groundswell of less miserables on the streets of all these towns, saying, you know, what we're going to do is certainly going to make us and our friends more wealthy, and doesn't that make you feel better? It seems like, to me anyway. But they're imposing this idea. This is from the CNN report on the climate apartheid. quote, as extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and hurricanes become more frequent, which they're not,
No.
the world's poorest people will be forced, and this is the horrific thing, choose between starvation and migration, the report warned, which to me stuck out because they're saying, okay, if we don't do anything, people might have to move. And
right. Back 3 feet. You've got 100 years. Move your beach house back 3 feet.
It's just amazing.
Because sea levels rise at the rate they've been rising between glaciations. That's what they do. All of this parade of horribles, the dogs and cats living together, seas boiling, skies turning blood red, none of it has proven in the decades of this alarm to be the case. None of it's outside natural variability. That very claim of climate refugees was one of the 10 money claims from Al Gore's fabulous film.
Which seems like a century ago.
The UK High Court tossed out, it asked, remember the dynamic of this lawsuit. It was a parent who didn't want his child being subjected to this. And again, I wrote about this in Red Hot Lies. In Canada, they were being forced to watch it in 4 classes, in PE and so on, but even science, which was reprehensible. But one parent took it to court in the UK, and the judge asked for evidence on 10 money claims. And the defendant was Her Majesty's government. Anybody named Her Majesty's government has the resources to defend, come up with some evidence, right? They couldn't support one of them, including, and the court found, I don't remember if that was the one about which it said, this is distinctly alarmist. It might have been the climate refugees.
Yeah.
It might have been the sea level rise, but regardless, they're obviously intertwined. And the court said there's no evidence of this. And Gore's saying, well, you may think it's fine here, but just over the horizon in Shelbyville, why it's horrible. And there are climate refugees everywhere. And the court back then said, no, we're still waiting, can't find them. And that's the case now. It is, you seize on what's the problem. Okay, refugees. Okay, well, we have climate refugees. Already they're blaming, as you know, even President Obama blamed the Syrian civil war on climate change writer Gore. Yep. And Obama administration officials and academics were saying, absolutely, it wasn't President Obama, by the way. It was Al Gore and a bunch of academics, which I think if you carry the one, adds up to President Obama. But they were saying, yeah, this is the refugee crisis, Syria. That was climate change. That was you. And these people, this man wants to stand in the way of global salvation. Get him, essentially. But you have to remember.
Send the lawyers guns and money.
Exactly. But nothing they're demanding. Here's the problem. It doesn't change the climate.
That's the thing.
That's the issue. Why isn't that the next debate question? Raise your hand. Show of hands. Who here's climate plan will impact the climate? Okay, now we'll go one by one. How much? And says who? Because nobody actually claims that. And it is, again, you want to talk about slothful media. Why don't you ask them? If somebody sort of nibbled around it with, will that save Miami? And then they let people dodge. No, after my policy, the seas will rise whatever level they were going to rise anyway. The temperature will be whatever the temperature was going to be anyway. So if you believe, let's just assume arguendo, the catastrophism. In fact, it's worse than they say. Great. I want to be richer to deal with that. You want us to be poorer. And don't get into this, well, you're greedy, you'll invent pixie dust, and then we'll all be rich from selling it to each other. We've been waiting for these miracle blubbers since before this started. As I noted recently, since these battery breakthroughs that are just around the corner, were just around the corner, defiantly, just around the corner when the internal combustion engine replaced the electric vehicle.
Right, and then we'll motivate. Yeah, once we switch away from everything, then they'll get better at it. Chris, there's something in this, climate apartheid, the latest version of Please Believe Us. I still go back to the fact that this all revolves around things like the Chicago Climate Exchange, cap and trade, and how they've managed to make something that really is just the Wall Street for the left, wingers to go out and say we've done something. I think your phrase is always, this is something, we need to do something, so therefore we need to do this. But at the end of the day, this actually is trackably back to Wall Street traders and mercantile traders and the upper middle class and wealthy, the Tom Steyers of the world and the Michael Bills who are out there profiting enormously through the buying and selling of climate, whatever credits we call them, noogies, whatever the word is next week, and Krugerrands, since we're using apartheid, and they get wealthier, and the poor still are poor, as you mentioned. So, is anyone tapping into what you guys are doing at the Government Accountability and Oversight LLC, or whether it's Climate Depot, Legal, so many voices? Are they still buying your book? I mean, your books are still so timely on these things, as you mentioned, Power Grab, Red Hot Lies, going all the way back to when they first concocted this stuff in the offices of what was that place? The smartest guys in the room. Enron, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Enron, but I'll have to tell you, it was Enron, and guess who I say our because of my glorious 3 weeks till I said this is
insane,
really bad stuff, guys. Their partner was Goldman Sachs. Okay, it wasn't Little Sisters of the Poor. In fact, I remember in the 90s, I'm pretty sure, one of the witnesses was the father from Catholic Charities of Cleveland, I think, and he laid out what you're talking about doing. You're talking about harming the most vulnerable that you're waving around as these trinkets, supposedly the reason that we need to do this. The people in whose name you demand these policies are the ones you're going to harm. Well, it wasn't cooked up by Catholic Charities of Cleveland. It was cooked up by Ken Lay, and he was working with Goldman. And I remember very well a late 90s going away party for some fancy Hill staffer where the head of Goldman's relevant practice area was laughing about the money they were going to make over this because I was probing. I'm like, the guy who couldn't shut up about this issue, I found myself sitting next to him. I had to ask him, were you guys you were working with Enron to set up their trading floor to sell these, to be bookies selling these ration coupons? You're not really into this, are you? I mean, this is just a rent-seeking scheme, right? And he didn't say yes or no. He just laughed about how much they were going to make from it. Remember, you've always had doomsday cults, and you've always had people on the street corner in surgical masks muttering to themselves. It's just when somebody like Ken Lay says, I think we could make a real shiny buck off of this. Am I mixing folding money with shiny? That we're, suddenly, and remember this, this is maddening when these TV business channel people say things like, well, even Wall Street supports it. Where do you think this came from? I mean, my gosh.
Of course they support it. It's like saying the Chamber of Commerce supports it,
Even, and unfortunately, a lot of folks are saying that I'd rather switch than fight. It's cheaper. I have all these shakedown lawsuits, everything else, attorneys general coming after me, getting mercenaries planted in their offices and so on. This was one of these catastrophist doomsday cults until Ken Lay and Sir John Brown of BP decided that they could monetize. Enron bought the world's largest windmill company with something like this in mind because they had the world's second largest gas pipeline network. And Ken Lay then set about buddying up to people like the governor of Texas and the president and vice president at the time, Clinton Gore. And I just want you to remember, it's out there. Robert Novak wrote a column about it at the time, not to date myself, but there was an August 1st, 1997 memo, a Friday, about the August 4th, Monday Oval Office meeting with Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Ken Lay, and Sir John Brown of BP. And they were getting to, the memo said, here's what you got to tell them. And it was, look, I know the Senate has already just instructed you a week ago, don't go to Kyoto and agree to this. But we're in the Constitution too, just in the back, and we think you should. And this is misreported all the time, but we did go to Kyoto. We did agree to Kyoto. We did sign Kyoto. We never unsigned Kyoto. Unfortunately, it's been overtaken by events, but the Senate unanimously instructed the president, don't do it. And in a private August 4th, 97 Oval Office meeting with Ken Lay and John Brown, Al Gore and Bill Clinton were instructed, thou shalt go to Kyoto and agree. And that's a really big deal because we actually did sign the Kyoto Treaty, just waiting till this noise machine that's now gotten its legs and throat and lots of bags of money would sufficiently scare people into pressuring their politicians to accept it. Cue discussion of the Paris Climate Treaty, which is sitting there on the shelf waiting for the same treatment. You've got to understand, it may begin this December or November when the next Paris talks are, and it may begin on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day next April.
which is one of those notables that they'll try to get a crowd like they used to. Al Gore and Tipper were always much more zealous about lyrics on the radio and lyrics on CDs and things like that. And then all of a sudden, he seemed to have this conversion to climate zealotry. Was it part and parcel? And I don't want to, put too much import on this meeting, but I always wonder if this was when Al Gore Climate Crusader was born.
He attributes it to his son getting hit by a car and nearly dying, if I recall right, from Earth in the Balance. And he became awakened or woke to his inner environmentalist. I mean, this was not a passion of his in Congress at all. And then he says there was this near-death experience, and he had a reawakening and became very concerned about the impact of. In his book, he says, on average, the child born in the Western world will have an impact on the environment that is many times, not really math, but anyway, on average, many times greater than the child born in the poor world. Meanwhile, he runs around with 4 blonde-haired children, was it 3 or 4 blonde-haired children, lecturing the poor world to stop having babies.
Right. And we still see that happening, the depopulation.
Oh, yeah. This was the old ZPG. This was a population movement ab initio. Sierra Club's longtime head, Carl Pope, was taken from. He was the political director of ZPG, and modern environmentalism has been an offspring, almost a retread of the failed ZPG movement. There's always just too many other people, and other people really need to fly less, and other people need to stop cramming all these seats up in business. And
which really strikes
other people
under the name apartheid. This really that point really kind of stands out with flashing neon lights, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a Western wealthy white obsession, and it is increasingly using the poor world as the reason to impose these policies that the Western wealthy world will never feel, that the wealthy ones, that are called eco-imperialism for a reason. You're talking about paying countries to not develop. You're talking about paying them to stay poor. You're talking about transferring more to kleptocrats and so on, with the individuals suffering. It's a terrible exporting of Western vanity. But it's all about other people, particularly those wretched poor people, being the problem. And again, this is not just off the cuff. This is something I've written about. Paul Dreesen has written about. A lot of people have written about. It's fairly well documented. If you recall, there's an individual who got promoted from being chief scientist of environmental defense to a board member named Charles Worster, who said, that's as good way to get rid of them as any. When somebody mentioned that banning DDT would lead to a lot of Sri Lankan babies dying these slow, painful deaths. Well, this is not really an up with people movement.
No,
and it's really down with other people.
Well, yeah, it's up with my people.
Every time you hear them say people need people this, people that, remember they're saying others.
Yeah. So before I run out of time, Chris, I know as a lawyer, your time is actually your stock in trade. So every time you're on with us, I'm keenly aware of all the work that you're doing for all of these things and trying to make ends meet while doing it. Government accountability and oversight. Please go there and help them out if you can. But what is the latest on the front of the weaponizing of our AG's offices through the Bloomberg pass-through money laundering at NYU program?
Well, we are in court now in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia, possibly somewhere else fairly soon, because there are a lot of attorneys general who don't want the public to see documents like we obtained from Virginia, where the AG's office told Bloomberg's organization that they would use the AG, quote, to advance the agenda represented by Bloomberg's group, which is just on its face staggering.
And I should
what's
say,
even more staggering is their claim that, well, we don't have any documents behind it. When we said it was legal and ethical, we didn't actually, we're lawyers, but we don't look things up or write them down. The argument in court was we're allowed to talk to each other in the hallway.
Yeah,
So,
that's a discovery. And a quick point, the General Assembly passed a bill that would have outlawed what's happening, and the governor vetoed it. So
well, no. So this passed, and the governor let that go, all right? So it is a restriction through the end of the fiscal year, and the Attorney General, in a letter to a delegate, Dave LaRock, did acknowledge this. Dave LaRock asked him, hey, I'd like to know if this is legal. And they said, your point is moot because of the budget provision. But he didn't ask if it's legal until July. He said, is this legal? And they didn't want to answer the question. Look, these guys are feeling the heat because they did really stupid things, like in this case, promised to use your office in a way that is on its face highly inappropriate, seems to be illegal, is definitely illegal through July, depending on what the next legislature does. And in New York, just a week ago Friday, so a week and a half ago, the New York AG filed a letter with the court saying, anyway, all this talk about these guys being improper, we've gotten out of that whole Bloomberg agreement. These two mercenaries he hired and put in our office, we've brought them on. So really, there's nothing to see here. There's no argument that they're. So what happened is, this is the key question, and I hope to talk to you about this in the near future. I expect some pieces on this soon.
Oh, okay.
Asking the question. The question is, so it's one of the following, Joe. Did attorneys general, these guys who got in on this deal, and ours applied to, he says he didn't do it, but anyway, these AGs, did they decide it was not worth the legal, ethical, and political risk to enter this unprecedented scheme, or did they decide it was not worth the legal, ethical, and political risk to publicly admit doing so? Because what I want to know is, where has all the boasting gone? This outfit could not shut up about all the attorneys general who fell over themselves to please Michael Bloomberg and bring on these mercenaries. Virginia's included.
Yeah.
The last press release was December of 2018, in which this Bloomberg group announced and quoted Mark Herring, saying, I'm happy to be participating. Now, they're telling the court we didn't ever do it, so I'm still trying to straighten that one out. But Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Oregon, they announced, have just accepted mercenaries from us. Pennsylvania and Virginia both swear they didn't do it.
To go after climate companies that contribute to groups like government accountability and oversight.
To stop the reforms, to clearly go after political opponents. In New York, they're signing briefs, they're engaged in all that, the plaintiffs' lawsuits and so on, the investigations. This is if you don't stop it here, don't say I didn't tell you so, because
precedent.
If you can do this here against your opponents on this issue, why not? I don't understand why the Family Foundation or gun owners, or if you want, if you really want to say it's an open field, abortion providers. I don't understand why a donor can't plant a mercenary, privately hired AG, special AG in an AG's office to go after political opponents. If it's okay here, where is this incredibly arbitrary line you're drawing? Because climate, because Bloomberg? It doesn't make sense that it's only okay here. But so far, again, our slothful media has not pressed them. Why, how in the world is this okay? And can I ask you the question, is it okay if the NRA does it with Ken Cuccinelli or the next Republican Attorney General?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they stopped boasting. The last press release announced 3 new AGs, 2 of whom swear they didn't do it, and since then, crickets. And what I want to know is, we know that Bloomberg then gave a subsequent, I think it was another $3 million, but we have emails showing they're putting out the call for more AGs to take these mercenaries to do this bidding. But they're not talking about it anymore. So the question is it like Virginia? They decided it wasn't. We're still trying to figure out what happened in Virginia,
right.
But they decided it was not worth the political, ethical, and legal risk to publicly admit doing it, or did they decide it wasn't worth the political, ethical, and legal risk to actually do it? Because something's going on. Bloomberg's pouring more and more money into this, but they've decided to stop talking about it. So is it because the AG said, you know what, this just isn't worth the candle, or they decided, yes, Don Bloomberg, but I just can't talk about it publicly.
All right, we got to lay low for a few weeks, go to the mattresses, and wait for the shiny object of the month being something else, and
or wait for an election. That's my guess.
Yeah,
there was a question, just real quickly. There was a question by a media outlet called Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, asking the Virginia AG office, okay, you keep saying you didn't do it, but will you do it? Like when the legislature goes home and they didn't answer, the piece is still up online. They refuse to answer the question. Well, that's the question before us right now. They won't swear it off. They're just saying, I didn't do it, go away. But I have a document saying, depends on what the meaning of the word it is. You did do it. I have the document saying you will use your office to advance the agenda represented by this group. You did it. You're saying you didn't consummate. You did, they just fiddled with your corset hooks and smeared your lipstick. But that was enough.
It was
that document.
It was Bloomberg's money on the dresser.
Yeah. Election or something.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate it. Again, summer reading, you go get all of them, but Red Hot Lies, Power Grab, Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming, all as important as they ever have been. And in this last case, the liberal war on transparency, again, is going to echo, and you're going to say, how long ago was this written? And it's just getting worse and worse the more we try to call them out on it. But God bless you and Suzanne and everyone, and have a great Independence Day weekend as we fire off incendiary devices and create clouds over our, county parks, etc.
Thank you. Happy Independence Day to you.
And thank you for joining us. Until next week, enjoy the rest of the Independence Day holiday from all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So long, and thanks for all the fish.